On a cool, still night, roughly 2 hours outside of the city of Bendo, Tirras Jacklin found himself walking. He didn't want to be walking. He'd rather be home, poring over his collection of aged Turnbid whiskeys. He'd only recently gotten his hands on a bottle 5 times his senior. An impressive number if one didn't calculate too closely. More importantly, it had cost him a third of his savings, but that was a small price to pay for such a treat. Yet, instead of pouring himself a glass and settling in for dinner, he was trotting through the dense undergrowth of the Garstindada Forest, marking landmarks as he went to ensure he could find his way back. The ministry, in all their infinite wisdom, had deemed him liable for his outburst at yesterday's gathering, and unanimously, save for Tirras himself, decided that a walk was a fair and justly punishment for his misdeeds. It wasn't often that the judges disagreed on anything. Dissent was a scar from the past. The judges of today displayed a united front with the expected consistency of a morning sunrise. Tirras would not have called his outburst dissent with even the most generous interpretations, but his fellows failed to see his side. At the very least, a walk was a far better outcome than the public flogging Sarah had initially suggested. But Sarah was, as far as Tirras was concerned, a barrel too full for her own good. The sister moons were bright tonight, but the thick canopy of trees overhead blocked most of the glow that could have illuminated Tirras's path. Instead, he was left with a smattering of green-tinged light to make out the mess of the forest floor. The late spring melt had yet to reach the denser sections of the forest, the long and deep shadows holding on to winter's chill for as long as they could. Tirras was becoming well acquainted with those shadows the longer he walked, the slick mud turning to icy patches. All the more reason this walk was foolish. His outburst wasn't something so inappropriate to require anything more than a simple reprimand. Sarah had spoken lie after lie after lie, slandering his name in front of the entire ministry and the public crowd that had gathered. He had every right to defend himself. Why his fellow judges insisted on protecting her was beyond his understanding. She gave no evidence for her claims against him, and didn't even bother to allow him the chance to reply. She forced his hand, and he was reaping the consequences. The ministry was meant to be a council, and yet, since Sarah arrived, it operated more like a monarchy. "We aren't the fucking Diani," Tirras grumbled to himself, slipping around a tree whose roots arched out of the ground like wooden ribbons. It wouldn't surprise him if Sarah had Diani family somewhere in her line with how she acted since becoming a judge. She had the same self-righteousness, the same polished air, the same need to be right. Diane Potnas had no business being as much trouble for the woodlands as it was, and neither did Sarah. Why she was selected at all remained as baffling as her immunity to critique. If Tirras ran things, people like Sarah would remain part of the laborers for the entirety of their lives. Tirras paused. Perhaps it was that line which had gotten him saddled with a walk. The revelation mattered little now. He would not be apologizing to Sarah, and he would return to the ministry with his head held high. While he didn't understand Sarah's induction, he too had been chosen, and that counted for something. He walked into the icy waters of Stone's Bay just like everyone else, and he'd been lucky enough to make it back. He would not be shoved around by some self-important wilt. Squaring his shoulders, Tirras walked with a loftier step, his mind buzzing with the things he would say when he inevitably returned to the ministry. Those lofty steps, however, grew heavier and more animated as the confrontation played out in Tirras's head, until he was stomping his way through a tangle of ferns into a broad, wide-open glade. Moon's light streamed unabated into the near-perfect circle of tall, swaying grass. The trees stood like frontline soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, awaiting command. Their shadows were short with the moon's almost directly above. It was warmer here, with a balmy, humid heat that was still months away from the woodlands. Tirras marched another 5 steps before his mind drifted from the bickering in his head to the strange scene before him. He slowed to a stop, tracing the edge of the tree line with his eyes. "Hello?" called Tirras. Not that he anticipated anyone would answer. In fact, once the words left his mouth, he scoffed at himself, a rebuke for uttering them and breaking the silence in the first place. Walking alone so long was spinning his mind backwards. Tirras was not a fearful man, embodying a much more brash and, dare they say, arrogant demeanor. He was a judge, after all, and doubt did him no good. Thus he strode further into the glade without another thought. It would be, at the very least, a nice place to rest for the evening before he began his trek back. Being that his ego would let him sit nowhere else, Tirras dropped down in the center of the glade, brushing the grass away from his knees. Or he would have, if a stubborn grass blade didn't continue to push against his leg. He grabbed the end of it with his fingers and was about to yank it from the ground when it suddenly, and violently, pushed free from his grip and wrapped itself twice around his leg. Tirras was not a fearful man, but it was fear that struck him deep in his bones. He tried to scramble to his feet, but the grass held tight. It wound faster and thicker, more and more and more of it pulling up from the earth, endless in length. It was no longer a single blade, but multiple, moving like muscle and sinew, the ends grasping like fingers. "Get off of me!" Tirras cried, the trees echoing his words in return. The grass blades were more like vines now, thick and continuing to climb. Another blade shot up from where the first originated, dancing its way higher and higher. The sound of the tendrils rubbing against each other was like a butcher's burlap against brick, building into another form along that which held his leg. Tirras watched with his heart in his throat as the newer grass blade wrapped around itself until it was closer in thickness to the trees. Shadows and moon's light danced over Tirras's stricken face, his blue eyes almost black. The writhing mass of vines began to shift again. Tirras's eyes widened ever further, blue ringed and white. A person. The vines resembled a person. A mismatched and misshapen person, but a person. Tirras's mouth dried. He failed to notice the tendrils around his leg now resembled an arm. All thoughts of escaping dissolved from his mind. The creature held an iron grip on his leg, but didn't seem in any hurry to harm him. It was more occupied by the straightening of its shoulders and the flexing of its many arms. Its head took on the appearance of an onion bulb, a large round sphere pinched at the top, that bobbled back and forth as if it didn't have the strength to hold it upright. Tirras was sweating. The glade was hot now, humid and thick, like midsummer along the shore. Even the breeze that circled Tirras was hot, the exhale from a baker's brick oven. "What do you want?" Tirras demanded, though his voice came out in a rasp. It might have been more embarrassing were he not frightened stiff. The creature stopped moving. It towered well over Tirras's height now, a small grass blade no more. If there was any doubt the bulbous bud was its head, it vanished once the bulb opened, blooming a fully formed and horribly uncanny face. Tirras's body stiffened, all of the blood flooding to his feet. The expression was gentle, like a slumbering child, eyes closed and both of its mouths slightly parted. Despite its sleepy appearance, the monstrosity was clearly watching him, its face craned down. A shiver ran up its viney frame from root to crown, where then, simultaneously, both mouths opened, dripping a sickly sweet melody into the thick air. The song twisted around his ears, and before he could form the words of what he was looking at, his mind was drained of color. The glade was hot to the point of discomfort. Tirras was on his back at the center of the glade. His eyes gazed up to the pair of moons who passively gazed back. The night was well on its way. Sitting up, Tirras brushed the dirt that lingered on his pants and, with the movement, felt the wetness under his arms. He had dressed for the cooler spring temperatures that the glade had seemingly skipped entirely. He frowned, plucking at the damp fabric before resigning himself to a terribly uncomfortable walk back. When Tirras got to his feet, his head swam. As if filled with liquid, it sloshed heavily side to side. Tirras squeezed his eyes shut and placed a cold hand to his forehead. It was an exhaustion weight, the kind Tirras recognized from his many late nights in his office. Too little sleep in an uncomfortably old chair. But Tirras didn't remember falling asleep. In fact, upon thinking of it, he didn't remember much of his walk at all, and trying to remember it felt akin to opening a rusted lock with a crowbar. Somewhere above him, a stigged began singing. The songbird owls, native to the woodlands, were often more active earlier in the night, but its song gave Tirras something to focus on, so he was in no place to contest it. The melody wrapped around him like a warm blanket, easing his head into calmer waters. The ministry had dictated a full night's walk, and were Tirras any judge, he'd be back in Bendo by dawn if he started walking now. The guardsmen didn't wear pocket watches. As long as the sun was above the horizon, there ought to be no trouble returning. The fresh air had done him good. A walk was exactly what he needed to see how foolish his descent had been. He was eager to rejoin the united front beside his comrades. He missed them more than he expected. With his head righted on his shoulders, Tirras started for the tree line. Tirras carried himself with a brighter demeanor, even with the slight limp in his step. He barely noticed, traipsing through the undergrowth with a newfound pep. The forest must have been pleased as well, for the song of the stiggeds followed him the entire way home.